For the afternoon, we're going to start really looking at the enterprise budgeting tool. And on that note, I would like to introduce Travis Greenwald. He is an ag economist with Highland Economics in Missoula, Montana, and he is going to talk to us about some enterprise budgeting.
Thank you, Tessa. And thank you to Organic Seed Alliance and RMA for having me here today. And also, Tessa, nice job on the planning. Right after lunch, we're going to get into a presentation that has no pictures, all numbers, spreadsheets. It's the most exciting presentation of the conference, I'm sure. But as she said, I'm here to talk about enterprise budgets. I'll have a few slides on the basics of why enterprise budgeting is important and the major components of enterprise budgets. And then I'll introduce the tool that was passed around as part of the conference, and then get into a few examples. Let's see, just getting everything set up here. But first, a little bit about Highland Economics. We're a small natural resource economic consulting firm, and we often, is there feedback? Oh. We often get involved in putting enterprise budgets together for the economic studies that we do. It's often related to feasibility studies for irrigation development or rehabilitation, or looking at policy program impacts in the agricultural community. So, personally, my wife and I own a small produce farm in western Montana, and then my dad and brother and I are involved in oilseed farming and processing in eastern Washington. So I'm involved in the ag industry, but it's fascinating for me to be here and learning about seed production. So same industry, completely different sector, completely different world. So really interesting for me. Okay, so there's a lot of reasons to use enterprise budgeting in your activities. Here are just a few of them, including a record keeping tool, where you're utilizing actual costs and returns from your operation to look at past or projected future profit potential. Enterprise budgets are also a useful tool in making decisions about which investments to consider or undertake, what type of crops to select, and thinking about things like where to enter the value chain with your product, or how much processing of the seed you might want to consider. And then a third one that Sebastian touched on briefly is this application for credit, proving to the bank that what you're proposing to do with the funds that they lend you will actually make money, and you'll be able to repay them. That's another key part about enterprise budgeting. And I would also like to mention here that on the keeping records is really critical for doing any sort of enterprise budgeting, because whatever budget or model that is created from the process is only as good as the assumptions that go into it. And that's where it's really important on record keeping. And I'll mention that Tanya Murray has been doing some work in this area, and she's going to be talking a bit about that later with Oregon Tilth. And then there's been a few publications out there on budgeting for seed production, but it's not as common as other types of enterprise budgeting. So one of the things that was developed for this conference was a tool that you can use, and I'll talk a little bit about that coming up. But the main objective with that tool is to give you a starting point to think about project planning and investment decisions. And hopefully you'll be able to use that tool or tweak that tool to your custom application. The main components of an enterprise budget, we'll just go through them briefly here. These can be applied to pretty much any crop, but they include the gross returns, which is a function of price and yield. And we heard earlier today that especially on the yield side, that this can vary widely. So doing sensitivity analyses, looking at different projections of price and yield is important, and later on I'll have some slides on that. Another major component is land costs. If you're leasing, that's an easy one, just plugging in what you're leasing your land for. But how do you think about ownership costs if you own your land and it's been in your family for 4 or 5 generations? Looking at what that land could be used for instead, that opportunity cost might be something that you would consider there. Operating cost, going through all of from planting to harvest, what are the labor and input requirements of those activities? And then equipment and machinery costs. This is or can be tricky when you're dealing with multiple crops. How do you split out your machinery costs for a 30-foot bed of peppers that you're growing when you're farming 20 acres, for example? So I can go through the tool and some of the assumptions used there, but trying to capture all of the operating and maintenance and ownership costs of equipment and machinery in an enterprise budget is really important. And then maybe the most tricky component here is the overhead costs, which are costs that can be attributed to the whole farm, but for purposes of project planning, you need to divide them out to a specific crop. So property taxes, or let's see, insurance, property insurance, that's another one. Some of these costs are, when you get into the weeds, they can be quite tricky in breaking it out on a per crop basis. Sorry. Yeah.
Could I just ask a question about the overhead? What kinds of, like, if you pop a tire on a tractor and you have to replace a tire, does that go into overhead, or is that something else?
That's a good question, Tessa. And so that's part of something else in the model that I sent around, but and I'll get into that here in a couple slides. But as I'm going through and I'm about to start going through the tool itself, and as I'm going through the tool, if a question like that comes up, please interrupt me, raise your hand, because it'll be easier to talk about it then than rifle through the slides at the end and try and get to it. But yeah, on that specific thing, that's captured in the repair cost of the machinery. That's a separate component of the tool. Okay, so like I mentioned, there's a lot of information out there. Enterprise budgets are often published by University Extension, USDA, or Economic Marketing Services has publications as well, but they often are centered around crops that are commonly grown in the area in terms of acreage. And while seed crops are a high value crop, they often don't take up the footprint that these other crops do. So there's not a lot of information out there in terms of publicly available information. So in light of that, OSA funded Highland Economics to develop a very basic enterprise budgeting tool for this conference. And the objective of the tool is, like I said, to provide this starting point for you in terms of project planning. The tool follows a general format where there's a handful of questions that are asked about your operation. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different worksheets that ask questions about your farm, the equipment that you use, inputs and activities that you're conducting, planting, harvesting, and post-harvest activities and inputs. And then that gets compiled into outputs that are in the form of budgets by activity and budgets on a per unit of area basis. And if you have the tool open, the blue shaded cells are cells where information is required from you. So that's the input piece. The red shaded cells represent estimates that are calculated within the tool, but these can be overridden where appropriate. And then there are buttons in the tool. And let me show you an example here. So that's kind of hard to read, isn't it? This button here is a macro, and it basically just clears the form. There's another button on this equipment slide, the red. This is, it'll reset the formulas that are in the red. As I said, the red cells are where some sort of estimate is generated within the tool. So you can override that by just typing in your number over the top of it. But if you want to replace those functions, you can hit that red button up on top. So the first worksheet that you come to is the farm information slide. And this needs to be filled out before you go further, because all of the calculations will depend on the area that you're cultivating and the size of your farm. So it asks for specifics on what crop you're producing, and there are drop-down menus here for the unit area. You can choose whatever unit area makes sense for you. And then this product is where you would type in the revenue, your revenue centers. So the type of seed that you're selling. And I should have mentioned this earlier. This tool is intended to be used for a single crop. So if you have multiple revenue items for a single crop, that can go in those lines, but it's not intended to be a whole farm profitability tool. It's only for a single crop. That would be cool to have a whole farm profitability tool, but it just adds a whole nother layer of complexity that is sort of beyond this project. So this is hard to see, but this is your land costs. So like I said, if you're leasing land, that's an easy one. You just put in your lease cost on a per acre basis. If you own the land, and you might want to think about including an opportunity cost there. And then information on your labor rates, and the tool has a place for 2 labor rates, and in reality you might have more labor rates that you're using on your farm, but this simple tool only has room for 2, and right now it's broken down between operator labor and other or hand labor. If you can change the categories to match whatever makes sense for your operation, but there's room for 2 labor rates right now. And then the overhead rate, currently this is set up to consider overhead as a % of your total cost. So generally, something in the 5 to 15% of your total cost is usually an overhead rate that's used in budgeting. But if you have specifics on your operation where that overhead is higher or lower, that's fine, because that's one of the inputs that you need to put in here, is the overhead rate, and that's a general overhead rate. And as you'll see, that this is meant to capture things like property taxes, office expenses, and those things that are hard to attribute to a specific crop, but are a general cost for the farm. And then these bottom two rows, I have to thank Sarah for coming up with this. These are, in the event that you are doing retail, what are the retail overhead costs, like the racks, or if you're doing printing on your packaging, branding, and things like that. That total retail overhead cost that isn't attributable to any one specific crop would go in here into this cell, and then the percent that you should assign to the crop that's being modeled would go in that cell below it. Another way of handling retail overhead costs is it'll show up later, but it's in the post-harvest input section. So there's multiple ways of dealing with that here. Okay, so this is the equipment and machinery worksheet. And for those who aren't familiar with Excel, you can move when you're on in the tool. You can just move from one sheet to the next by clicking on these buttons down here. So we're going to kind of walk our way this way. So we're only in number 2, and hopefully no one has fallen asleep. If you do fall asleep, I'm not going to hold it against you. Yeah, we have a question. Yeah.
Can you say again the difference between the production area and the total area? Like if you have a 10-acre farm, but you're growing a 1/4 acre of crop, what numbers do you put where?
Yeah, so the production area this budget encompasses would be your, say it's chard, and you're growing 5 acres of chard. So that's the 5 acres, and your farm is 100 acres. The 100 would go under total area under cultivation. And the reason that's important shows up in the equipment and machinery, dividing out those ownership costs for your tractors and implements into specific usage, and dividing that ownership cost amongst all of your land instead of just the 5 acres of chard. Any other questions? Oh. Okay, so here's the equipment and machinery. Again, the blue cells are inputs, and there are several different types of machinery and equipment that you can include here. We have power units, implements, harvest equipment, post-harvest equipment, irrigation, and a few columns for other. So this is where questions about the types of equipment that you're using are answered. And in the blue, the red again is where automatic estimates are generated inside the tool. So a few things of note here. All of the calculations that occur that will show up in the happen in the machine cost. It's abbreviated MACH cost spreadsheet. It's towards the far right. And the factors spreadsheet, which is in the tool as well. And for equipment and machinery, it's basically where those spreadsheets are where the major assumptions are put in. And for example, for every $1,000 of equipment that you include in this, in these cells, there will be $4.50 of insurance that shows up here. And for all of the fuel that is automatically calculated, there's a 15% lube and oil cost. And there are various repair cost factors that range from 60 to 120% of the purchase price. All of those calculations happen in the far right, the machine, and it's sort of behind the scenes. For purposes of this tool, to make it user-friendly, we just hard-coded some of those assumptions in. And so when you answer the questions in the blue, you'll automatically get your cost estimates for insurance and interest and lube and oil and fuel costs and repair costs. All of that will automatically be calculated. But if it doesn't match with, if you have some specifics on your operation and those aren't matching, there's you sort of have two options. If you want to continue using this, you can just override the red cells right here, and it'll still feed into the output of the model. Or you can get into the guts of the model, those MACH cost tabs on the far right and the factors tabs on the far right, and adjust the assumptions that are built in. So a couple different options for you there. And I'd encourage people to spend some time with this and tweak it to your specific operation. And if this doesn't work for your operation, make your own model with factors that are specific to what you're doing. This can, like I said in the beginning, this is sort of a beginning tool, a starting point basically for project planning. Okay, now the next three worksheets have the same format where questions are asked about the activities that you're conducting for the seed crop. And it starts with identifying, listing out what that is here, where it says describe here. And then these two columns are your labor costs, those two rates that we talked about earlier. And then this, the next two columns are your timeline, so beginning and ending period. And that mainly feeds into this timeline output. That's a part of the output of the model that shows not only when the activities are occurring, but the cost and the magnitude of the cost associated with that activity relative to the others. And then there's four options for your inputs. So for the inputs, it asks for a name, a quantity of whatever input, a unit, and then the cost per unit for the area that you're modeling here. And like I said, this is the same for the inputs and activities, the planting. One thing I will note about the planting is we included a couple rows here for starts. If you're doing greenhouse operations, you can put in the cost for those starts here. And then the harvest and post-harvest is the same format as well. And there are a couple rows that are meant to capture other activities that might not be, easily classified. And for example, if your field is 5 miles away from your barn, and you have to drive that every day, you might want to consider putting in like a other cost of driving out to the field or something. Again, if you start filling this out and you want to just clear the form, you can use this. There's a button on the top of all of these that'll clear the form. Okay, So now that sort of walks you through the tool, the inputs that are required. Now I want to get into a specific example so you can see an output of the tool. But before I do that, are there any questions on what's needed as far as input to get an output for a production budget? Yeah. And can everyone hear me okay? I feel like I'm squatting down. Okay.
If we were using row feet instead of acres, could we easily do that
Yeah.
in there?
Yeah, so on the farm, let me go back to that really quick. Oh, the question was if we're using row feet instead of acres, can this model handle it? And the answer is yes. This blue cell right here and the one below it right here are actually drop-down menus. So when you're in the tool, you can select a different unit, and row feet is one of them. In fact, I think there's 3-foot bed on center, 5-foot bed on center. There's different options in there. And then that will automatically calculate throughout the model. So just be aware that when you change that to row feet, and then you go to this one, for example, inputs and activities, this will be for every certain number of row feet, what are your inputs, not per acre like the default is here.
Sure, I have a question. So then if it calculates through, and then you're also looking at area and impacted unit within that inputs and activities. So are you mixing there? So could you have acres for your whole farm and then row feet for area of impacted?
You can, unit? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and the costs, I'm going to say should and not will, because there might be a bug in here still, but the cost should automatically adjust. So when you get to the output, the costs should be in the area that's being modeled. That's one of the outputs. And then another output is cost on a per acre basis, if you were to either roll up or roll down to the per acre basis. Okay. Okay, so let's look at an example. One other thing I forgot to mention, as we were developing this, I got a lot of great feedback from Tessa and Sarah and Sam and Sebastian and Tanya. So it was sort of a painful process. I don't know, we had like 15 iterations or something, but it was really great to get this to actual growers' hands and get some feedback. So thank you so much. This is loosely based on some feedback from Sam. I've changed some of the numbers just for presentation purposes, but we're looking at a shard seed example, 8 acres of production on a 600-acre farm, where cleaned seed is sold, and we'll walk through those same slides that we've been looking at, but now they're filled out for this specific farming operation. And it's so hard to see. Sorry, but I'll just kind of briefly go through the assumptions. So we have 8 acres that are producing 600 pounds of shard seed. Price received is set at $50 an acre. The cost of land is modeled at $175 an acre. Labor rates are 20 per hour for the operator, 15 for the other. General farm overhead is set at 5% with no retail overhead. And then here, We have a 4-wheel drive tractor, 2-wheel drive tractor, a couple 2-wheel drive tractors, offset or heavy tandem disc, a spring tooth harrow, a roller or packer, a seed drill, a spreader. Oh, is that possible?
I want to just see here. Oops.
Well, how about I just walk through this real quick and then I'll get into the Excel version. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so then, the other thing is a solid set sprinkler irrigation is modeled here on the far right. Okay, so this is the inputs and activities. We have some fertilizer on the top, fertility management using cover crop here. Let's see, this is the cultivation in rotiller, and then S times below it. And for each of these, we have a time period, hour estimate, and then for the fertility, we have input costs are included up here. Did you say the irrigation under equipment? Yes. So it actually goes 2 places. It's included under equipment to capture the ownership cost of the irrigation, and then it goes in the inputs and activities at the very bottom here to capture your labor costs associated with that. Yes, specific to irrigation. Yeah. Okay, so then the next one is planting, and it starts with land prep on the top. So we have 18 hours of land prep, 10 hours of harrowing, then the dates, and the area impacted again. And this might seem repetitive because in every activity we're asking for the area impacted, but in the event that you have, let's see, let me give an example. Roguing or hand weeding, if that is less than the total area, if you're doing that on say 2 acres, it's only going to assign that cost to the 2 acres when you compile the budget at the end in terms of a per acre basis, instead of applying that cost to all 8 acres. So hope that makes sense. Okay, and then we have the harvest and post-harvest activities. So harvest is occurring mid-August swath, and then combining early September. And then post-harvest activities occur September and October. And we have drying, air screen, decortication, and a spiral separator. So all of this is built in. The only input that we have here is the propane drying, and then the sack for the tote sack at the end. Okay, so this is one of the outputs of the model, and it's basically a calendar with the blue shaded cells showing when the activities occur. So here's the list of activities and when they're occurring, and it's set to the darker the color, the more cost it is. And again, I apologize, it's a little hard to see here, but what really jumps out here is this fertility management. This is one of the highest cost activities that's occurring in May. So this is useful when you're thinking about planning to know for working capital purposes, how much working capital do you need before any sort of revenue is coming in, And not only that, but when is that capital needed in terms of the growing season? So then another output of the model is what I call a budget by activity. And each activity is broken down into your equipment and machinery costs, your so these two columns here are tractor and equipment, and then you have your labor costs and your input cost for each activity, and then that rolls up into a total cost. And all this is based on per area modeled. So we were looking at 8 acres of production, so this is for all 8 acres of production. Then the other output is costs and returns, but instead of by activity broken down by the various components for that activity, this is looking at by cost component. So you have your variable expenses, which include the inputs, the labor, fuel, all of your repair and maintenance costs, and then your fixed expenses, which is mainly your ownership costs and some overhead costs down below. And so then those tally up to look at the income and variable and fixed expenses on a per area model. Again, for this, it's looking at 8 acres. And like I said, what we realized was for crops, because most enterprise budgets that you see published are on a per acre basis, some of the crops doesn't make sense to have it on a per acre basis. So that's why we included the per area modeled. But then another output, so sort of the third output, we have the timeline and then the per area modeled. This is the per acre basis where it breaks it down into a per acre basis. Regardless of what unit you're modeling. So if you're only modeling 100 feet of 5-foot bed, it's still going to roll everything up into a per acre basis here. And we have the by activity and then by cost category as well. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, if you own your land, how do you think about ownership cost of land? And I just touched on this briefly earlier, but I would encourage people to look at their opportunity cost for that land. So it might be what land is being sold or what land is being leased for in the region. Because you, in theory, you could lease that land out to another grower and get $170, $200 for the acre. So that's what I would include as an ownership cost. There's other ways of thinking about that, but that's what I would recommend to people. Does that make sense? Yeah, so I think I can better answer this once I pull up the Excel version. But the question was, how do you think about a tractor that is part of the way into its useful life, and what sort of price would you put in there? This tool is using straight line depreciation, so I would put in the original purchase price, and then the per hour cost of owning that would be fairly close. There's a whole bunch of ways to think about for taxes. There's accelerated depreciation, you might use if you're trying to depreciate that equipment or machinery more quickly. And but for this, we're just using straight line depreciation. And so if you have other ways of thinking about ownership costs, that's where I would encourage you to just override those red cells down below. and then you wouldn't need to worry about putting in a equipment price for the machinery if you have like a specific ownership cost that you'd like to use. But for this, I would recommend using your purchase price. Yeah. And that kind of gives you a ballpark estimate. Again, there's so many caveats with this tool, but it's meant to be a starting point, and it's probably an okay tool for everybody to consider, but it's not like a great tool for any one person. So, any other questions before we go on? Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay, so in the beginning I mentioned one of the capabilities with enterprise budgeting is sensitivity analyses. And as you know, in agriculture, there can be a wide range of productivity off of your seed production activity. So I'm going to present 3 ways to frame sensitivity analysis, 3 ways of thinking about it, just for your purposes. And for this one, we looked at, instead of the 600 pounds per acre that was modeled previously, we looked at a yield of between 400 and 700 pounds per acre. Sorry, not per acre, 400 to, that would be pretty cool. 400 to 700 pounds on 8 acres. And then a price of between $40 to $60 per pound. So most of you have probably seen this type of table where you look at price range. Here is the top row, and then here's your yield in terms of pounds per acre. So the 400 to 700 on 8 is about 50 to 88 on a per acre basis. And then the dollar values in the middle then are the net income per acre, net returns per acre. And you'll see how it fluctuates from a low of 400 to a high of 3,400. And so this is a fairly standard way of thinking about how to frame a sensitivity analysis. Another way is to do what I call a tornado, where you look at the variables in your model that are most uncertain, where you have the most uncertainty in your production, and then you model what the net returns might be for a reasonable range. And this is assuming all other variables are constant. So assuming everything else stays constant, if we have a yield change of the 400 to 700, it's going to impact net returns by this much, and on the price by this much. And this is just a really simple example of a tornado, but you can imagine if you included labor costs, overhead, fuel costs, you would start stacking up the tornado, and it would start actually looking like a tornado then by the time you're done. So again, it's another way of showing a reasonable range of your net returns instead of a single point estimate, because agriculture is not manufacturing, and we know that there's variability in the production. Okay, and then here's a third way, and this is a histogram, what they call a histogram. And you can think of this bottom axis here as your range of net returns, and this is your frequency, basically, or your probability. And what we can show is when you clip your ends, so I've set this at 10% and 10%, we're showing a net return per acre of between basically $1,300 and $2,300. So another way of saying that is there's an 80% probability, based on everything that's in the model. There's an 80% probability that the net returns of this shard seed would be between $1,300 and $2,300. And I think there's a famous like used car TV commercial that uses this, right? That they made this famous. And oh, I should also mention this. You can use Excel to do all of these things, but when you start getting into a table like this, every is going to be a different iteration of the model. So you'd have to go tweak your yield or change your yield number and then report your net return in a table like this. That would be basically like the manual way of doing it. There are statistical programming softwares that you can buy as add-ins to Excel that would achieve this in basically a click of the button, but they tend to be expensive. So unless you're doing this for a large company, it probably doesn't make sense to have that statistical programming. So I would suggest when you do these sensitivity analyses, pick a reasonable range, and maybe don't pick as many steps along the way as I included in the table, but pick something that is reasonable for the key uncertainties and go from there. Okay, so here's another example of hot peppers in a much smaller unit area than we were looking at with the shard. So we have 30 feet, a 5-foot bed of hot peppers in a 9-acre farm. And the yield is 1 pound of seed, roughly 1 pound of seed at 1,120 per pound. And I'm not going to walk through all of the inputs like I did with the shard, but instead of selling at a wholesale level, this was assuming a retail level. So it had included some of that retail overhead that we were talking about earlier. And here's one of the outputs, the timeline. You'll see most of the activity is between June and November, and the major costs are the post-harvest activities. And then this is on a per area modeled basis, looking at all the different activities broken out by ownership, operating, labor, and inputs. Again, on a cost basis, the same thing, but on a cost category basis. And if we were to do sensitivity, looking at plus or minus of yield of 20% and a plus or minus a price of 15%, we would have a table like this. So this tells us that it's reasonable to expect between $400 and $870 for that 30-foot row on a net return basis. And then just some general closing thoughts I had here is, again, this emphasis on the record keeping, I think, is key for utilizing enterprise budgets, because for planning purposes, how are you going to know what you could do if you can't remember what you did? And then I really encourage everybody to take pieces of this or take the whole budget and customize it to your operation. So really get into the guts of it and understand where some of these ownership and operating costs are coming from. And I'm happy to answer questions about some of the assumptions that were hard-coded into the tool. And then finally, I think maybe one of the most powerful things with enterprise budgeting is being able to do those multiple iterations and run a sensitivity analysis to show, okay, what is reasonable to expect, instead of just taking a point estimate and using that as your basis for going forward. So I think that wraps it up. Okay, congrats for not falling asleep.